Welcome to this clean water webinar. We're so happy to have you with us today virtually. I'm Heather. I'm the Midwest Save Our Streams coordinator with the Isaac Walton League of America, and I'm joined by Dr. Lindsay Pease. She's assistant professor and extension specialist in nutrient and water management with the University of Minnesota Extension. And today we'll be talking about strategies to reduce nutrient pollution, which is a big subject and a really important one. But before we dive into the meat of this webinar, I do want to do some housekeeping. First off, we are recording this webinar, so if you want to revisit it later, we'll be sharing that recording most likely tomorrow, whenever the webinar recording is available. So keep an eye out for that. Also, we will have time for questions at the end, and I encourage you, as you think of a question, to drop it in our Q&A. There's a speech bubble icon on your Zoom screen right now called Q&A. That's a great place to put your questions so that we can get to those one by one at the end. There's also obviously the chat function. Make sure to say hi in there, let everyone know where you're tuning in from, and we'll get started. So before I hand things over to Dr. Pease, I do just want to give a little bit of background and kind of contextualize the purpose of this webinar in the context of what the league is doing. So as we are going to hear about nutrient pollution, one of the nutrients in question is nitrate. And we actually have a program that specializes and focuses on monitoring nitrate pollution, and that's called Nitrate Watch. So real quick rundown of Nitrate Watch. This program launched February of last year. So if my math is right, we're just about a year and a half on. And really excited to see how many folks have been involved in this. If you are involved and you participate in Nitrate Watch, you can say so in the chat so that we can see who's represented here. But essentially what this is, it's a community science project that equips folks across the country with free nitrate test kits as supplies allow. And it encourages them to monitor nitrate in the drinking water and the surface water that they rely on. And of course, report that data back. So we won't belabor this too long, but there are lots of reasons that it's important to know how much nitrate is in our water, whether that's surface water or drinking water. There's some health impacts that come from drinking water that has elevated nitrate, especially if it's over a prolonged period of time. Some of those are really well known and talked about, things like blue baby syndrome in little ones that have been exposed to nitrate laden water. But there's also some maybe lesser known and lesser talked about issues like cancers and thyroid disease and other birth defects that can come from drinking water that has elevated nitrate. And some of those issues even come when our nitrate levels are actually below the drinking water standard. So very important and cause for concern, I would say, issues. The environmental issues related to nitrate pollution are popping up across the country right now. Things like algae blooms we see this time of year, dead zones, both in the Gulf of Mexico and closer to home. And then, of course, fish kills, which are a result of that high nitrate in the water, causing the aquatic life to really suffer. And then, of course, all of that carries a big price tag. There's a paper that was put out in 2014 where they tabulated all of the sort of impacts to the economy from across many sectors, treating our water, losses in tourism and property values, the environmental cleanup efforts, and a lot more. And it came out to over $2 billion annually that the US spends responding to this issue. So hopefully you understand why we find this to be pretty important to talk about and to monitor. So the goals of Nitrate Watch are pretty simple. We want to raise awareness about this issue. We want to talk about it more. We want more people to be aware of the really direct link between nitrate and water and all of those issues that we just mentioned. We want to identify hotspots. Enlisting the help of volunteers across the country really helps us do this. We can see places where nitrate pollution is really pronounced and also places where there's a lot of people measuring and really engaged in the issue. And then ultimately, last but not least, is advocating for solutions. And again, this really connects to what Dr. Pease is going to talk about today. How can we prevent this nutrient from getting into our water in the first place? We don't just want to monitor an issue, we want to help be a part of the solution. So when it comes to raising awareness, I think there's no more powerful thing than to put scientific equipment in people's hands. And this is something you can request at nitratewatch.org for free. We'll send it to you in the mail. Give us a week at least. We're not Amazon. It's not going to come overnight. But it is free as supplies allow. So that's pretty good. And it'll include a bottle of nitrate test strips and everything you need as far as how to use the strips and how to report the data. It's super simple. We have lots of support materials online, and I'm also happy to be a resource if you have questions. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. Also, we've got tons of educational and outreach materials to try and round out folks' understanding of the issue from lots of different angles. This webinar series is one of those resources. You can also find fact sheets. You can join our newsletter and get monthly updates and news. And also, this has been a fun project this year, these Clean Water Minute videos that we've been putting out on social media. They're short, they're silly, but they're educational, and they've all been focusing on this connection between soil health and water quality. So a really, fundamental issue when we're talking about nitrate pollution, especially. All right, so when we talk about identifying hotspots, we're obviously talking about crowdsourced data, and that's coming from volunteers all across the country, and it's going to the Clean Water Hub database. This is, again, a free resource. It's even if you're not submitting data, you can go on the Clean Water Hub and explore, see other people's data, see what's happening in your neck of the woods. And they're designed to be really easy to access and understand, and then ultimately use to communicate or just to increase your own understanding. So there's all these color-coded maps and graphs to really make the data make sense and be useful. Really quickly, I'm not going to dive too deep into the data, but we did do a little bit of analysis at the end of June, so like halfway through the year. We just wanted to see what the numbers were looking like so far. And this is such a cursory analysis. We just looked at all the data coming in across the country. We didn't zoom into a specific region. We'll do more of that in our annual report at the end of the year, but stay tuned. But as you would expect, most of the readings came in that 0 to 3 milligrams per liter range. This is what we would hope to see, what we would expect, especially considering some of this data is drinking water data. So we don't want to see super, super high nitrate in our drinking water ever. But so that's good to see. But then, of course, I will point your attention to the greater than 10 milligrams per liter. If you're familiar with the nitrate drinking water standard, it's actually 10 milligrams per liter. And this number, it can include surface water and drinking water. Most of the readings are surface water, I will say. But that's a pretty high percentage of our readings coming in at that high number. This has been a pretty wet year following some years of drought. So that can have something to do with that. Also, asterisk, this is just the first half of the year. As we include the last half of the year, those numbers might level out a little bit more, but we will see. So stay tuned for more analysis in the annual report. And again, this data is open source. You can download it, do whatever you want with it. It's on the Clean Water Hub. Let me know if you need help accessing it. And then a tiny little tangent, just another way to visualize this data. We averaged it out over each week, the readings that were coming in. And this is kind of the curve, the effect that we saw happening late spring into early summer. There was definitely a peak, which we're not surprised by, as there's more nitrate being applied to the landscape, and then of course more rain carrying it off. But really interesting to see that phenomenon. We actually put out a blog about this if you want to find it on our website. We call it the spring flush, basically. This is national data. And then I did zoom in on the Iowa data because we just have so much coming in from Iowa. And you can see it's the same shape, but just a lot more pronounced. The average in early June was cresting over 14 parts per million, and that's average. So there's a lot readings that are higher than that too. So definitely a lot of nitrate flushing Iowa's waters. If you're from the upper Midwest, you're probably not surprised to hear this, but there you go. It's in black and white. Again, moving quickly just because I want to have plenty of time for Dr. Pease to talk. But just one last thing is that third goal, super important to us, is the advocating for solutions, turning the data and the volunteer engagement into something real. And so whether you're adding your name to our petition or you're following along and even taking part in our agriculture team trying to get a farm bill passed this year to solidify funding for some conservation on the landscape, or even if you're signing up to receive action alerts, you can head to the Isaac Walton League's website to take part in this stuff. There's an action alert specifically about nitrate pollution and talking to your reps about taking action and addressing this issue directly. There's several other action alerts right now that I would say really dovetail into this as well. But it all kind of gets back to elevating the issue and addressing it on the landscape. So with that, I did want to bring Dr. Pease in today to talk to us all about some of the ways that we can use natural, practices to mitigate the pollution before it even reaches our waterways. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and let Dr. Pease take it from there.
All right. Well, and thank you very much for that introduction and for the invite to be here today. I am super excited to talk about this. Um, just kind of in general, talking about strategies to reduce nutrient pollution. Just make sure that I have there we go. There we go. You'd think we'd all be experts at these webinar things by now. I find these technical difficulties never fully go away. But thanks for everybody for showing up today, or if you're watching later, it's also great to be here. One of the things that I think is really important is, that reducing nutrient pollution requires a targeted effort. If you try to go out there and say, everyone on the landscape needs to do one practice, and this one practice will save, all the waterways in the United States, we know that's not true. There are no silver bullets. And this is no different, when we are talking about managing water runoff from agricultural landscapes, things are different. Nitrogen and phosphorus themselves are different, and they require different management strategies. It's really important then, knowing that you define the goals for your watershed and your area. What are those targets that you have in mind? Because, as I was watching all of the chat roll in with where they were from, I'm like, oh yeah, Chesapeake Bay is going to be a lot different from Western Lake Erie Basin. Is a lot different from Iowa. And of course, yeah, those of you that were even outside of those areas. So it's really important that you define what the goal is for your local area. And I think the other thing that I would like to suggest, for those of you that are trying to work with landowners, work with farmers, or even just advocate amongst your neighbors, thinking about that portfolio of options for those landowners and land managers, and I do include farmers in this kind of land manager categories, they may or may not be the owners. And getting a portfolio of options for them to choose from is ultimately going to make everybody feel like they have a voice and a say, and make everybody a lot more excited to participate in the process. So what my talk today is really going to be going through, what kind of are those options? What do we know? What's the science behind some of these practices that we are recommending people to put out on the agricultural landscape? But first, I'm going to talk just a little bit about me. As you could see from the title, I work for University of Minnesota Extension, but I am physically located at that star that's up along the North Dakota border on the map. I work actually about 3 hours from Canada in the Red River Valley of the North, or about an hour north of Fargo. Most people do not know where Crookston, Minnesota is, which is where my office is located. But before that, I do bring a much broader perspective of the Midwest than just this little corner of Minnesota. I grew up in Ohio's Western Lake Erie Basin, just upstream of Toledo. And if any of you have heard of Western Lake Erie Basin before, I'm sure many of you have, we are famous for our harmful algal blooms. This is an image of just the harmful algal bloom that happened. This was 2011 was the largest one that had happened on record to that point. But that one wasn't the most famous harmful algal bloom. The most famous one happened in August of 2014. So we are almost 10 years from this event that was really critical in shaping my personal journey in nutrient management, but also, but also really, I think has led to a lot of research into this area. So, if any of you have not heard of this, in August of 2014, the water intake, that's the concrete structure you see out in the lake of Lake Erie, that supplies drinking water to about 400,000 people in Ohio and actually includes, the water that I grew up drinking. My parents drink the water, my neighbors, I have friends. So, this was it was a personal impact on me as well as a professional impact. Harmful algal blooms came up around this intake, and the algal toxin got in the drinking water supply. What ended up happening is that they, called everyone up on the phone. They contacted everyone and issued a warning: do not drink the water, do not even touch the water. And we don't actually know when the next time your water is going to be safe. So, as you can imagine, this was a huge, panic for people. Bottles of water flying off the shelves, a really major event in the watershed, and also, for the country to think about. These are the real impacts of, what even harmful algal blooms, we'd heard a lot about them, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, but this is what can happen when they get out of hand in freshwater systems. And we did find out that phosphorus load predicts algal bloom size. So, pretty early on, we did have an idea of phosphorus load coming through the Maumee River and then into Lake Erie correlated very well with that size of the algal bloom. So, if we could work on practices that minimized phosphorus loading to our streams and waterways, then we could help prevent some of these future actions, some future harmful algal blooms from happening. So that is what my entire research was based on when I was in Ohio's Western Lake Erie Basin, was looking at phosphorus loss both in surface runoff and subsurface discharge, thinking about what are the levels, what types of things, like what makes it worse, what makes it better, just looking at those concentrations and the different pathways. But I won't only be talking about phosphorus today, because phosphorus is, of course, what I am an expert in, but nitrogen, a lot has affected in a lot of watersheds as well. Basically, most of southern Minnesota, that is the primary target. And most of these practices, we need to look at them together, because you don't usually have just a phosphorus problem or just a nitrogen problem. You do need to be addressing both. But it's easy to get focused on just one or the other as the primary target. But some of the differences between phosphorus and nitrogen I have up on the screen here. Nitrogen is going to be our most common fertilizer applied, the most common plant nutrient. Almost every crop, soybeans do not get nitrogen, but basically everything else will get nitrogen applied on an annual or semi-annual basis. Nitrogen it is not very stable in the soil. It can move into the air with microbial activity. It can move into the water. It dissolves very easily in water. So that is what makes it move rapidly down the soil profile with water. And then that gets into either groundwater or can get into subsurface drainage discharge, um, and be exported out to streams and rivers. Nitrogen, we usually talk about that as the limiting nutrient for algae growth in saltwater systems. So those are our coastal systems like Chesapeake Bay or the Gulf of Mexico. Really, the target is nitrogen, because that is the nutrient that once that algae gets it, that allows them to really grow. That's the equivalent of that graph I showed you on the previous slide about phosphorus leading to algal growth. Phosphorus is going to be the second most common fertilizer that's applied on our agricultural landscape. Uh, but this one behaves a little bit differently than nitrogen. Where I said that nitrogen is pretty dynamic in the soil, phosphorus tends to stay in place. Phosphorus is a lot more bonded chemically to the soil. It has different charges, charges that attach to electrical charges on the soil, which I won't get into because lunchtime is no time for a chemistry lecture. but we do know that phosphorus for the most part sticks to the soil and stays there. But the problem is that there is a fraction that does release from soil particles or just never attaches. Again, it's a chemically based process. So if you get too much absorption into one place, there's no binding sites, there's no place for it to bond to the soil. It'll just exist freely in the environment. And the really big challenge with phosphorus is that these dissolved forms are very bioavailable. Algae love that dissolved form of phosphorus. They will just take a very small concentration and just go crazy. For lack of a better term. So, as Heather had mentioned in the previous, in her presentation about the drinking water standard being 10 parts per million for nitrogen, phosphorus, what the concentration that is associated with harmful algal blooms is much, much lower than that. It is 0.05 parts per million. So you can imagine how just that small fraction can lead to big impacts downstream. And not only do we have multiple forms of nutrients we need to be concerned about, usually there's two ways that these nutrients are getting into surface water. Of course, we have surface runoff. That is, when you have a really high intensity rainfall event, the soil cannot absorb. Usually the soil cannot absorb more than about 2 inches per hour. That's on average. It's of course going to be different from soil to soil. But if you get a really high intensity rainfall event, that water can't absorb and it will just run off the surface. Surface runoff is really flashy and high impact. And that's what we see with nutrient loading too, because it's carrying a lot of soil particles with it. It can carry a lot of dissolved phosphorus with it, and it can carry a lot of water. Subsurface tile drainage is kind of like the slow and steady of the same version. You don't have as much flashiness, but it will pick up the water will pick up particles on its way down the soil profile, and it will filter down through the subsurface drainage systems. Now, subsurface drainage is one of those things that is really helpful for farmers when they have a lot of standing water in the field, early spring, early snow melt. This helps a lot for them to be able to get crops in a timely manner and for the fields to not get stuck. They don't like to be driving in the mud, just like you wouldn't like to be driving in the mud. So that's really one of the main reasons why we have subsurface drainage as an agricultural practice and why that does help things like keeping crop prices down or crop costs down, so then the food we eat can be produced a little bit more cheaply. The other kind of aspect of nitrogen is this nitrogen leaching to groundwater. Of course, this is what, Heather actually did a great job setting this up. That's really a risk to drinking water supplies and to communities that get their drinking water from wells. And actually, in my water that I drink here in Northwest Minnesota comes from groundwater. So this is something that I am interested in too. My local watershed doesn't really have much of an issue, as you can kind of tell from the map. We don't really have as much of an issue with nitrate in the groundwater, but I know this is a major, major concern for many communities as well. And this again has something to do with the types of soil that you have. This is going to be more common in quick draining, sandier soils. So traditionally, I've worked in, agricultural drained soils, kind of heavy, they call them heavy clay soils that the water doesn't drain through very quickly. This is kind of the opposite problem where the water just gets the nitrate in it, drains through really quickly and goes into and eventually accumulates into an aquifer, which is used as a drinking water source. So at the beginning, I said, what is your goal? What kind of a goal do you have? Because we have these different aspects that we need to manage and different balance. And there's only so much, money and time that we can use as our resources. So this really comes down to a local decision. What is the primary goal of your local area and your community, whether that's fresh water, and I usually consider that lakes, rivers, obviously included as that as well. Salt water, going to be a little bit different. Um, as I mentioned, Gulf of Mexico and Chesapeake Bay being different from Western Lake Erie Basin, our freshwater algal bloom, and of course, groundwater. But we can sort of all agree that that end goal, the outcome of safe drinking water supplies and healthy downstream ecosystems, that's the piece that like we all can agree, and including myself, that picture on the screen, that's my dog. And we often, are taking her walks in parks, along rivers. We like to kayak. We like to also recreate in the streams. And so, that's also a goal for myself as well. Just so you know where I'm coming from with this, I think we all agree that that's the goal. But then how you get there requires a little bit of targeting. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about in-field strategies. And this is going to be a little bit of a brief overview of these different practices, but I do have some papers that I cite throughout. I'll have references at the end. And if there's time, we can ask questions. But of course, we can also, willing to share my email address at the end and answer further questions as you come up with issues down the line. But our in-field strategies, these are things that farmers can do in their own fields to help minimize nutrient loss, just right at the source. The first one that works for any of those goals, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, groundwater, surface water, is this idea of 4R nutrient stewardship. And I'm sure many of you have heard this concept before. This has been around for quite some time, but I still talk to farmers about this as well. I think this is number one in making sure that your nutrient losses are minimized. Thinking about making sure those fertilizer rates are correct, that they are applied at the right time so that they're not washed away with drainage or washed away in surface runoff. The timing at being close to when the crop can actually use it. And also the placement. And the placement idea we're actually going to get into a little bit later. And I will say most farmers are basically doing a lot of this already. And when I say most farmers, of course, that's not going to be everyone, but the majority of farmers, and especially who I work with, fertilizer, especially nitrogen fertilizer, is expensive, and that cost is going up. A lot of them rate fertilizer as the number one economic cost of their operation. They have to spend year after year. So getting that rate dialed in and getting that efficiency dialed in is actually really important to most farmers. So that's why in my day job, I actually do a lot more soil fertility work than I ever thought I would need to. And that's just because if we can reduce the amount that they're applying, then and the benefit of that is that you can optimize, and make sure that the farmers are getting the most out of what they apply. Fertilizer source and rate sort of do go together. One thing that ends up being a really hot topic, especially if you're in a heavily animal agriculture area, is this idea of manure application on farm. One of the research projects that I got to participate in when I was a postdoc working with USDA was that we started to look at these losses and we looked at the differences between organic sources, that's your manure, versus inorganic, your commercial fertilizer. And the story's a little bit more complicated than it seems on its face. For the most part, organic producers, organic growers, over time, they have used the landscape as a way of storing and disposing of their manure. And that has built up levels over long periods of time. So if you just are looking at a random farm where they apply manure and a random farm where they apply commercial fertilizer, often you'll find that farm where they've applied manure for many decades has higher phosphorus losses. But inherently, there is no difference between phosphorus as a source. This comes into this idea of legacy phosphorus, where these levels have built up for so many decades that you have residual phosphorus losses. The phosphorus it's bound to the soil, but it's leaking a little bit at a time out into the waterways. So there's really nothing inherently wrong with applying manure. It's just you have to be really careful and think about the total capacity of the soil to hold that manure and make sure that if you have a situation where a field has had manure applied for many years, work to address that specifically. But first, we're going to transition away from that nutrient management, that fertilizer question, and talk about cover crops. Cover crops provide vegetative cover during the non-growing season. And that growing and also the decomposing cover crop, both of those work to tie up nitrogen in the environment. They slow it down from those different transformations that it wants to take because the crop roots can take up the nitrogen, and also the microbes in the soil, the biology, when that residue is breaking down, they'll also be using that nitrogen as to be able to break down the carbon. So they're using it all the way through that green period through when that residue is kind of turns to straw and breaks down. And of course, it has that benefit of reducing soil erosion. You have the crop roots physically holding it in place. You have, from a water movement perspective, a little bit more surface roughness. Actually, we talk about that with surface runoff and in hydrology a lot. The surface water actually working to be slowed down by this rough surface that you would cause with either stubble or cover cropping. But the flip side of cover cropping and the challenge and the answer to, well, then why doesn't everyone just apply cover crops? Is that it does add a management challenge during an already tight spring planting window. Farmers usually don't have just one field they're planting. They're trying to network across many fields. And in fact, a farm, and especially in my area where you have a lot of space, could be as many as 1,000 or more acres that a farmer is trying to manage. So they're really trying to get everything planted in a timely manner. And having cover crops does add a complication, especially if you have a heavy rainfall year. Now, this photo that I have on a slide is from a timing and rate trial that we're doing up in West Central and Northwest Minnesota. We call it our Planting Green project. And basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prove that you can plant soybeans into a living rye cover crop successfully, uh, even in our far north cold climates. And so far, the answer is yes, you absolutely can do this. But as you can see in that picture, the foreground, the rye has laid down nice and flat. The soybeans are coming up pretty happy. The soil is covered. That is a win-win. But right behind it, that rye was terminated too late. It was planted at too high of a rate, and it has totally overtaken the soybean crop. So, management is really super important. It's just one of the most important things of that early rye cover crop. In a year like we had in Minnesota this past spring, that with had so much rainfall, the farmers really struggled with that timeliness of getting out in the field. We actually have an on-farm component of this trial, and the farmer had to just drop out of the trial completely because he wasn't able to plant his crop that we had our cover crop in. So these challenges do come up. The other challenge that we have in cold climates specifically, so thinking about, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, Vermont, New Hampshire, is that a lot of the cover crops that are kind of favorites in other regions, they will not survive our winter. I've tried many different cover crop species, and the only thing that really survives are those cool season grasses, which are limited in their application, especially because we grow a lot of wheat crops. Wheat and barley and other small grains are major crops for my growers. That means that a cover crop that's the same type as the crop they're subsequently growing could cause issues with disease carryover. It could cause issues with pest carryover. There are some things, this is why people rotate crops that make the cool season grasses a little bit less effective. Now, what I'm hoping to see, and I know that these things are in development, are some more cold tolerant crops. I have heard a lot of good things about camelina and pennycress from my colleagues at University of Minnesota, and I know they're working on more cold tolerant varieties. But right now, we really are limited to kind of rye, wheat, and barley as our possible cover crops, and that's a challenge. The other challenge we have, and I would just want to say this too, is that wind erosion is still a very serious challenge that we deal with in the Red River Valley of the North. This is a picture that I took this past spring. You see that wind blowing across the field. So even though I kind of said, well, maybe some cover crops are harder to manage, I fully want to recognize that this is an important issue, and that personally, I have a lot of interest in trying to figure out how to make these systems work better in our farmers' rotations. So another way we can address those big wind erosion issues is with reduced tillage. This ends up being a positive in that you can save labor and fuel, fewer trips across the field. Ends up being a win-win. You have a lot of soil structure and soil health that is preserved. But I think one of the main challenges, especially for farmers who are looking to get into this, is that it does require you to buy all new equipment. Now, that equipment can be sometimes, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which may or may not be cash they have on hand, right? Just like anything else, like buying a new house. It's the equivalent of buying a new house for a farmer. Um, the other issue that is coming about more recently is herbicide resistant weeds. Uh, no-till and glyphosate tolerant soybeans, Roundup resistant soybeans, seem to kind of come together at the same time in the 90s in popularity. And there's a reason for that, because the weed management, that mechanical weed management that you do with tillage, was then no longer necessary because glyphosate was a great tool that people could use to control weeds. And tillage is really one of besides preparing the seed bed, that's really the main benefit of tillage is weed management. So as some of these weeds have become herbicide resistant, just like how bacteria species become antibiotic resistant, the same thing happens with our weed and pest species. And so farmers are losing a tool in their toolbox that helps make reduced tillage easier to transition to. So again, we're still working on kind of what that balance is, but sometimes that's where, just a little bit of seeing where somebody is coming from, and that answer of why don't we all just already do this? That is a potential reason why. The other issue that sometimes comes up with tillage is that there is a soil adjustment phase. The soil is used to having that tillage, and it takes time for that improved structure to build up. Um, this seems to be fairly universal when I talk to people, whether they're from Iowa or from Minnesota or from Ohio. It seems to be maybe like in that 4 to 5 years, maybe even up to 7 year period where they feel their soil is adjusting before it kind of catches up to where it was productivity wise from from before switching to reduced tillage. So that can also be a challenge, knowing that farmers are going to take maybe a little bit of a yield hit in terms of tillage. when it comes to their infield production. The other issue that I will say that I see somewhat with reduced tillage is that, if anybody had Facebook or still has Facebook, it has that it's complicated relationship with the nutrient loss. It's not necessarily, for erosion control, works great. We can agree, especially that wind erosion picture I showed in the last slide works great for that. But for some of those other nutrient targets, it can be a little bit complicated. One issue that that I have seen, and I actually included the big review papers that I looked at on the bottom of the slide, is that for when it comes to nitrogen losses, it doesn't really do a lot for how the nitrogen is moving through the soil. If you improve soil structure through reduced tillage and consistent reduced tillage, then you can improve the ability of the soil to infiltrate water. And that's a good thing for reducing to surface water. Now, if your concern is reducing nitrogen into the groundwater, I'm not 100% sure. I think it's complicated, and I don't know necessarily that that would be a good thing, because if you have more water and has more nitrogen carrying down into aquifers, you could end up in a scenario where you are increasing nitrates. So tillage on its own is maybe not the best practice for those scenarios. But I did say there's no silver bullets, but we have that portfolio of options. If you're pairing reduced tillage with other things like cover crops or reducing fertilizer rates or optimizing fertilizer rates, then you can start to gain those benefits back. These practices stack on top of one another, so it's not just one or nothing. You can do more than one of these things at a time. For phosphorus, I'll draw on another quick example from Western Lake Erie Basin. One thing that we saw farmers start to adopt with reduced tillage is that they would broadcast their commercial fertilizer on top of the soil surface. That's that picture that you see in the upper left-hand corner. You see fertilizer granules just on top of the surface. Now, it's going to take a rainfall for that fertilizer to dissolve and attach to the soil, but it doesn't really ever make it much further than the top 2 inches of the soil. So what we want is we want that fertilizer not to be broadcast, but to have an opportunity to bind with the soil. There are no-till injection systems where you can inject fertilizer, you can inject manure, you can place fertilizer below the ground surface. But again, that is another equipment cost that a farmer would need to purchase. But that's where, when you start to get that reduced tillage, you have to think about then where you're placing your nutrients to be sure that you're getting the maximum benefit. Because, like I mentioned before, phosphorus is sticky. It likes to attach to the soil. And then once it's attached, it'll stay there, but it needs that opportunity to bind to the soil. Another way we can do this, just when we're thinking purely about water management, is blind inlets. Surface intakes, also called a Hickenbottom drain, are a way that farmers can bring surface water into a surface inlet, and that can then be discharged, usually through a tile drainage system, out of the field. And adding a filter to that surface, it does increase the contact time of fertilizer and water with the soil, which, is a plus and a minus. It's a plus for the phosphorus losses. Like I said, it gives opportunities for any of that loose phosphorus to bind to the soil, but it does slow down the process of draining a field, which a farmer may or may not be willing to accommodate. Okay, with blind inlets, and I brought in tile drainage, I'm going to switch gears to these edge of field practices, edge of field strategies. We do know that nutrient management alone is not going to be enough to address all of our issues. If we were, then this webinar would have been a lot shorter. We have this goal of When we do as much as we can in field, then we move to the edge of field. These practices are usually a little bit more construction intensive, a little bit more expensive, but they really do help to eliminate some of that excess fertilizer when you reach the point of it entering streams and waterways. And I will say this is where these practices will not necessarily work well for groundwater unless in situations where you have interceptor drains, or drainage systems that can intercept the nitrate to feed it into a tile drainage system. So I'll just start with that caveat for anyone who's really interested in the groundwater stuff. The first practice I'm going to talk about is controlled drainage. This is a practice that actually I did my entire dissertation on, looking at the water quality benefits of controlled drainage systems. Controlled drainage systems, basically what this is this acts like a dam at the outlet of a subsurface drainage system at the edge of that tile outlet. And the concept of this is that farmers really want that trafficability time in their field when they are planting and when they are harvesting. But if the field stays a little bit wetter during the winter or even during certain parts of the growing season, that's not going to affect their operation. So we have this strategy of just manually stacking boards inside of a control structure, which are the gray structures that you see here on the screen. And it's a way that you can then reduce the losses, reduce the volume of water that comes through those subsurface drainage system, and then reduces the nitrogen and phosphorus along with it. And so at the bottom, you see some different graphics of the different management strategies during the non-growing season. You still need a little bit of an outlet just for when things are really, really wet, like during snow melt periods. You still need to be able to have the surface outlet or the drainage system outlet a little bit. But during planting, it can be free flowing. You stack it up in the growing season again, and then you let it freely drain at harvest. Now, what we have seen through doing research across all the Midwest that sort of spans, even including North Carolina. So we have data from North Carolina and as far north as southwestern Minnesota and South Dakota. We don't have a lot of information up where I'm at yet, but that's on my to-do list. And we see a pretty universal reduction in discharge and in the nutrients by about 40%. This practice doesn't do much for that concentration number that may be in the water. So your load reduction, the amount released to the stream, really is tied up with that discharge removal. But I think it's a really positive sign that we can reduce those discharge amounts so consistently, even across a very wide portion of the US. The challenges with this practice, of course, because there have to be pluses and minuses, are that you would require a retrofit of an existing tile drainage system. Sometimes tile drainage systems have multiple outlets, so the cost would definitely increase as you do construction and have to outfit these. We do see that there's a lot more management that the farmers need to do, obviously pulling the boards, stacking things in there, taking them out 2 or 3 times a year, maybe. And of course, if you have boards stacked in during the growing season and you get really wet, you may need to pull some of the boards and release some water so that you don't accidentally drown the crop. So that's another active management thing that farmers would need to add to their to-do list. And sometimes that just doesn't happen. So that's been one of the main issues with controlled drainage. Even though we know that it works, it's getting people to actually engage and manage the practice when things get busy. The good news is there are automated control structures that are being researched right now, ones that will automatically close and open, that is actually removing the human element for this. So I have a lot of hope for controlled drainage practices in the future, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So stay tuned for future updates on controlled drainage systems with automated structures. And of course, the uncertain effects on groundwater leaching are something that, we fully acknowledged as researchers, but we're never quite able to address. Grass waterways and riparian buffers and buffer strips are another thing, especially in Minnesota, that get a lot of attention. In Iowa, we actually have a buffer law that was passed in the state of Minnesota that required a little bit more space for a little bit more of that space between the edge of the field and a waterway. And this again helps to hold soil in place, slowing water down, just like those benefits of cover crops. But the challenges of that, of course, are that it permanently takes farmland out of production. And in terms of a nitrate benefit, this has big benefits for erosion again, but soil nitrogen is usually not that high in these areas. So you don't see that same benefit that you would with a cover crop in the field. One of the ways you can address that, though, is with a technology called saturated buffers. This kind of takes a control structure like I showed in the 2 slides ago, and instead of outletting directly to the stream, you can run a perforated drain along the side, actually where those white tubes are sticking up along the side of the river. That is where we have that's where that pipe is running. Those are monitoring wells, of course, that you see, but that also acts as a good visual reference. These help redistribute the subsurface discharge beneath the buffer. And we see really positive effects on that. It works similar in load reduction as the control drainage system, but then you get a really big benefit of nitrate load reduction by pumping that water out and allowing it to flow through the soil. Early studies of phosphorus are promising, but we do need more information on this as this is a newer practice. These other next two practices I'm going to talk about are two different types of filters that you can use to basically filter the water as it comes out of the tile drainage system. One of the more popular ones, especially in Iowa right now, denitrifying wood chip bioreactors. These use the microbial activity to filter nitrate from subsurface tile water, and it's released as an inert nitrogen gas. So just like the same nitrogen that is 80% prevalent in the atmosphere. These have a long lifespan. They can become buried in the ground. And but their performance does vary by the design, but you get an average of 5 grams of nitrogen removed per meter squared per day. So that adds up over an entire growing season. Phosphorus removal structures are basically designed to be the phosphorus equivalent of that because the wood chips aren't going to do much for phosphorus. So this uses a phosphorus sorbing material to help bind that phosphorus and remove it from water. And again, I will say this one is still a developing technology and still has a lot of bugs to work out with respect to optimizing it for on-farm use. And that's partially because the materials are a lot more expensive. This particular filter had a steel slag from a coal-fired power plant as the filter material. And you can imagine it was kind of difficult to get that to the site, to put it in the filter. And then it only lasted about 2 years before it needed to be removed. It worked well for those 2 years, I will say, but it was supposed to last quite a bit longer than it actually did. So that's the last practice I'm going to talk about. I know we're getting close on time, so I'm going to just wrap up here by saying most of the farmers and especially the ones that talk to me, maybe I'm biased, maybe only the farmers that talk to me are the ones that want to be good stewards, but I overwhelmingly find in my work that farmers want to be good stewards of the land. I have a lot of farmers that I work with on research, testing these practices and evaluating how practical they are for their operations. And then the work comes in fine tuning these practices to help them work better in our watersheds. But they may have some constraints and concerns that affect their ability to adopt new practices. One of the things that I had brought up before was about livestock operations. This idea is something that not growing up on any sort of livestock farm, was surprising to me when I found out about it. So I'll share it here with you all, is that manure storage and disposal issues can be a real issue. farmers, they like to apply it on their fields, obviously, because that is their way of disposing of the manure. But if they don't have a good system of storing that manure so that they can either sell it or truck it away, which is expensive, selling it is also difficult. But they have this disposal, this waste management issue that I think a lot of just the banning animal applications on the landscape don't address. What this also doesn't address is the idea that, if someone had applied manure for 40 years in the same spot, which actually the research farm that I work at has a field exactly like this. We haven't had any animals since about 2010, but the 30 to 40 years before that, every year they spread manure on the same field. So that field, even though we have no animals on the landscape at all anymore, we still have a legacy phosphorus field that we have to deal with. The other issue that I say is definitely more common in some watersheds than others is this idea that the farmers are not actually the landowners. They are renting the land from other people. And I have had that brought up to me as an issue that prevents them from maybe installing one of these more expensive practices on the landscape, is that they don't own the land and they don't want to jeopardize necessarily their relationship with the landowner. So there's some education that needs to happen from with the people who own the land and helping ease that conversation with the people managing the land. But I think it's just important, and this applies to everything. Being open to a conversation about what might work for someone's operation is really critical. And just hearing what their concerns might be, and when they're concerns and you hear them, if you think, well, wow, that's a good concern, that's when you can call in scientists like myself, and we'll work on tweaking that practice to meet those mutual goals. And also, and I will throw this in too, is that financial assistance is so important for them to reduce the risks to their personal operations. This is their livelihood. And if they're going to either invest a lot of money in a practice or try something out, they are putting their livelihood at risk. So that's where, the financial assistance, and there are a lot of great programs already in the United States, but helping connect farmers with those opportunities is another part of my job, because I know that it's hard for sometimes, people to make that jump when they know they need all new equipment or cover crop seed for all their acres, those sorts of commitments. So just to wrap up, these are the main points I showed you at the beginning, and so we'll just hit them again. And that is, there are no silver bullets. Nitrogen and phosphorus are different and they require different management strategies. Hopefully, I tried to hit some of those differences, as we went through these different practices. Also, defining your goals. It's going to be really hard to say we want to prevent all of the nutrient losses with one practice and it's going to be resolved forever. You have to do some targeting yourself of defining what's the main priority and how are we going to get to that one priority first. And finally, developing a portfolio of options like I've presented here that help landowners maybe have a little bit more, feel like they have a little bit more of a say in what they're doing on their operation to choose from. And I think ultimately then everybody wins from that scenario. So with that, here's I know that most of you, if this is being recorded, here's a big long list of the papers that I cited as we went through. And with that, I know we are 2 minutes from 1 o'clock, but I am happy to stay on and answer questions if there are. Well, and I know that there are. I can see that there are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pease, for that great presentation. Oh, my video went away. I'm still here. That was a great overview of that menu of options. And I love that you included not just the benefits, but also the challenges and the barriers. I think a lot of us on this call are probably coming from that perspective of always, prioritizing conservation and water quality, as I think, is a good thing to do. But it's important to remember just how complicated it is and that there's a reason all of these things are on the landscape already. So like Dr. P said, this is recorded, and if you do need to hop off, we will share that recording tomorrow, if not sooner. But I will go ahead and dive into the questions. If you guys do have questions, please continue to add those to the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. The first one is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but we'll ask it anyway. It's is there any consideration to the negative impacts on water quality from the tremendous amount of chemicals applied to urban lawns?
Yeah, this is a question that that I get asked quite a bit actually. Is what about the other people using the watershed or living in the watershed? And I do tend to, and I think that is a big question mark. I think we don't have a lot of really good information about what is coming, from our urban, suburban landscapes. And these practices absolutely can be used if there is an area, an urban area that needs treatment. I think we can use a lot of these and adapt a lot of these practices. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, is that and I think a lot of times, especially in Western Lake Erie Basin, right? The farmers felt a big, finger pointed back at them, which is kind of, where I want to encourage you all to avoid and just consider that, yeah, there could be other sources and things we need to address as well.
Yeah, I would definitely just reiterate that, when we look at the sources nationwide, agriculture obviously comes up as like one of the primary, if not the primary
Yes.
source, but that does not relinquish us all from responsibility. If you're applying fertilizer to your lawn, you need to recognize that you can be part of the problem too, and that there is a proper rate of application, and you should test your soil first and all that stuff. So,
Yeah.
this is an urban problem as well as a rural problem for sure.
Yeah, and actually that was something we did for the first time. My house, we tested our soil this spring and sent it into a lab, and are going to plan our fall fertilizer application. So, there
Nice.
are definitely opportunities available for everyone, and most university programs, extension programs offer a service that you could look into.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, this next question that came in, I'm going to do my best to summarize. So, they are looking at regenerative agricultural practice to reintroduce soil microbes and fungi balance, um, post routine of inorganic fertilizer application. This should see plants making use of legacy phosphorus. Do you know how quickly this is likely to work through legacy total phosphorus?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think that is a really important line of questions, a line of work that I am personally, interested in. And I think if you are going down that path, keep going down it, because we don't have a lot of information yet about how long that might take and how well that would use. But I think that would be great if we could figure out a way to unlock some of that P and make it more available, especially in certain soil types. And like I mentioned, we have a legacy field on my own research farm, uh, that we're working on. And I think some of that does have to do with the history and the levels. If something is at a 400 soil test, it's going to take a lot longer, decades uh, to fix that than say something that's, maybe just over the optimal level for the soil.
Sure. Um, Folks can still drop a question or two in the Q&A, but in lieu of any, I do actually have a question. And I know this could be probably like an entire other webinar, but I'm curious, Dr. Pease, if you could wave a magic wand and change something, what do you think would be one thing that is needed to get more of these practices on the landscape? You mentioned a
Yeah.
little bit in your
Mhm.
talk, but what would you change?
I think one of the things that I might change would be, oh, that's such a good
I know,
question.
sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I guess I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is really that equipment challenge. The when the especially when we're talking about infield practice, reduced tillage. I think reduced tillage has such potential, but it does come with that, really expensive. You need a new planter, you need different tillage equipment. Now you need to think about placing your phosphorus below the soil surface. That's another piece of equipment.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really big hill for farmers to climb. A smaller hill to climb, I think, is adding controlled drainage to your system. I think that's a much lower investment and still management, intensive,
Yeah.
but I think that's something that's a little bit easier to get at than, replacing something that costs as much as a house. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure they're not getting cheaper, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, we had one more question come in, and it relates also to homeowner and like suburban application. I think maybe we need to do a webinar on that topic too. I'm gonna write that down for sure. But they were interested in sort of the difference in prioritizing reducing nitrogen versus phosphorus, and I think specifically in a freshwater environment. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yes. So, yeah, so I will just kind of reiterate that, and maybe I didn't, and in case I didn't clarify it well enough before, I would say really in freshwater systems, phosphorus tends to be the target when the end water body, especially, is a freshwater system, like the water ends up in a lake, um, or even within the river system itself. You don't want to have algae, especially reservoirs that are used for drinking water. That's where I consider phosphorus to be more the issue of concern. Now, I will say it's not to say that it's not of concern in freshwater environments, especially where, and I suppose the big example of this, right, would be Des Moines, Iowa, which gets their drinking water from a freshwater river. So they are very concerned about levels of nitrogen, not just at what's happening, in the Gulf of Mexico. So, so those practices, I guess I kind of lump them into well, that all goes to the Gulf of Mexico. So a saltwater system, but that's not really what I meant. So,
It's all
it
important, I think.
it is, yeah. So hopefully that answered that particular question, Allison. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, and thank you, Dr. Pease, again for hanging on a couple minutes after and for this great presentation. I think that's all of our questions for now, but her, email address is on the screen there. You're also welcome to reach out to us if you have questions about Nitrate Watch or about anything else, or ideas for future webinars, because clearly we have more to talk about. But thank you again, Dr. Pease, and thank you to everyone who joined us and asked such great questions. And we hope to see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.